Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we explore a crime so brutal it sent shockwaves across 1930s Britain. Known as the Ruxton Murders, this case involves jealousy, betrayal, and a gruesome crime that pushed the boundaries of forensic science to solve. How could a successful and respected doctor hide such dark intentions? And how did his meticulous cover-up unravel under the scrutiny of groundbreaking forensic techniques? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling story of Dr. Buck Ruxton, the savage surgeon, and the murders that changed criminal investigations forever. Dr. Buck Ruxton was born as Bukhtiar Rustomji Ratanji Hakim in 1899 in Bombay, India, into a wealthy and influential Parsi family. From a young age, he was seen as ambitious, intelligent, and determined to make something of himself. Ruxton pursued medicine, eventually earning his degree and establishing a promising career as a physician. In the early 1920s, Ruxton left India in search of greater opportunities abroad. He settled in Britain, where he anglicized his name to Buck Ruxton, hoping to assimilate into British society more easily. However, as an immigrant in pre-war Britain, Ruxton faced subtle and overt forms of racism and discrimination. He was determined to succeed, and despite these challenges, he built a reputation as a compassionate and skilled doctor. His medical practice in Lancaster, England, became popular with the locals who appreciated his gentle demeanor and dedication to their care. But while Ruxton's professional life flourished, his personal life was far more complicated. Ruxton met Isabella Kerr, a young and vibrant Scottish woman, in the mid-1920s. Isabella was previously married and had a son from her first marriage. The two quickly developed a romantic relationship, and Isabella left her previous life behind to live with Ruxton. Together they moved to Lancaster, where they settled into a comfortable home and had 3 children of their own. Isabella was the perfect complement to Ruxton's public image. She was charming, outgoing, and well-liked in social circles. She brought grace and sophistication to their family, often attending social events and hosting gatherings at their home. To the outside world, the Ruxtons were the epitome of a happy, successful family. But behind closed doors, cracks in their relationship were beginning to show. Ruxton had always been a man of strong emotions, but over time, his insecurities began to dominate his personality. He was deeply possessive of Isabella and obsessed with controlling her every move. He grew paranoid, frequently accusing her of being unfaithful, despite having no evidence to support his suspicions. These accusations were not fleeting arguments, but prolonged, heated confrontations. Neighbors and friends would later recount hearing shouting matches from the Ruxton household. Isabella, known for her strong will, often stood her ground, refusing to let Ruxton's accusations control her. This only fueled his anger further. Ruxton's jealousy extended beyond Isabella's social life. He became suspicious of anyone who spent time with her, including their maid, Mary Rogerson. Mary was a quiet and diligent worker who had been with the family for several years, but Ruxton often viewed her with distrust, fearing she might encourage Isabella's independence or report their household conflicts to others. As the years passed, Ruxton's paranoia intensified. His jealousy grew so severe that it began to affect his work. Patients and colleagues noticed a change in his demeanor. The once kind and attentive doctor became irritable and short-tempered, prone to sudden outbursts of anger. It's believed that Ruxton's mental state was exacerbated by the societal pressures he faced as an immigrant and a man striving to maintain his image in a predominantly white, upper-middle-class community. He may have felt that any perceived failure, whether in his marriage, career, or personal life, would undermine the respect and success he had worked so hard to achieve. This need for control, combined with his growing paranoia, created a pressure cooker environment in the Ruxton household. Friends and neighbors later described the atmosphere as tense and volatile, with arguments becoming more frequent and more intense. By September 1935, Ruxton's paranoia had reached a breaking point. He was convinced that Isabella was having an affair, though there was no evidence to support this claim. Some accounts suggest he believed Isabella was involved with a family friend or had rekindled a relationship with someone from her past. Isabella's attempts to maintain her independence and social life only fueled Ruxton's suspicions. He began monitoring her activities obsessively, questioning her every move and accusing her of deceiving him. The psychological strain of their toxic relationship was evident to those around them, but no one could have predicted the horrifying outcome. Beneath the mask of a loving husband and respected doctor, Buck Ruxton harbored a volatile combination of insecurities, jealousy, and rage. On the surface, he was a man who had overcome adversity to build a successful life. But in reality, he was a deeply troubled individual, grappling with demons that would ultimately drive him to commit one of the most gruesome crimes of the 20th century. It was the evening of September 14th, 1935, and the Ruxton household in Lancaster, England, seemed no different from any other night. But behind the facade of calm, tensions had been simmering for weeks. Dr. Buck Ruxton, already consumed by jealousy and paranoia, was spiraling into an uncontrollable rage. In the days leading up to that fateful night, Ruxton had grown increasingly suspicious of his common-law wife, Isabella Kerr. His mind raced with unfounded fears of infidelity. He became obsessed with the idea that Isabella was seeing another man, possibly a family friend or someone from her past. Every glance she exchanged with another man or outing she attended was twisted in his mind into evidence of betrayal. According to accounts, Isabella had spent part of the day away from home. Some reports suggest she had visited Morecambe, a nearby seaside town, while others say she was simply out running errands. Regardless, her absence, even for a short while, seemed to fuel Ruxton's paranoia. By the time she returned home, he was already seething with anger, convinced that she had been meeting a lover. What started as yet another heated argument between the couple quickly escalated into violence. The details of what exactly transpired remain speculative, as there were no witnesses apart from their maid, Mary Rogerson. Ruxton's accusations against Isabella were likely more intense than ever that night. His rage, compounded by years of mistrust and insecurity, reached a breaking point. In a fit of uncontrollable anger, Ruxton attacked Isabella. It is believed that he strangled her, though some accounts suggest he may have used a blunt object during the attack. What is certain is that the violence was brutal, and Isabella stood little chance against his overpowering strength. Her cries and struggles were silenced as Ruxton took her life, leaving her lifeless body in the home they had built together. Unbeknownst to Ruxton, Mary Rogerson, the family's young maid, had likely witnessed the horrific murder. Mary had been a loyal employee for several years, known for her quiet and hard-working nature. On that night, she may have heard the commotion and come to check on her employers, only to stumble upon the unthinkable. Mary's presence posed a significant problem for Ruxton. She was a witness to his crime, and in his warped mind, she became another threat to his freedom. Driven by a combination of panic and cold calculation, Ruxton decided that Mary had to die as well. He attacked Mary with the same brutal force he had unleashed on Isabella, silencing her forever. The Ruxton household, once a picture of domestic normalcy, had now become a grisly crime scene. 2 lifeless bodies lay within its walls, one of a wife Ruxton claimed to love, and the other of a young maid who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. For most people, the enormity of what had just occurred would have led to immediate panic, perhaps even a confession. But Ruxton's mind worked differently. Instead of breaking down, he quickly shifted into damage control, calculating his next steps to cover up his crimes. Ruxton began by cleaning up the evidence. His medical training and scientific knowledge made him meticulous and methodical, traits he now used to conceal his brutal actions. He worked quickly to remove any trace of the murders from the house. The bloodstains on the floors and walls were scrubbed, and the bodies were moved to a secure location within the home. Ruxton knew that the longer the bodies remained there, the greater the risk of discovery. He had to act fast, but he also had to be precise. At this point, his focus shifted to an even more horrifying plan: dismemberment. To him, this was the only way to dispose of the bodies without leaving evidence that could trace back to him. He believed that by cutting the bodies into pieces, he could make them unrecognizable and harder to identify, ensuring his crimes would never be tied to him. That night marked a dramatic transformation in Ruxton. He went from being a respected doctor, a healer of the sick, and a loving father, at least on the surface, to a calculated murderer willing to do the unthinkable to escape the consequences of his actions. The emotions he felt that night, rage, jealousy, and paranoia, were replaced with cold pragmatism. In his mind, Isabella and Mary were no longer the people he had lived and worked with for years. They were now evidence that needed to be destroyed. By the early hours of the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The children, asleep in their beds, were blissfully unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded just rooms away. The once warm and lively home had become a silent tomb, and Ruxton, though outwardly composed, had already sealed his fate with his actions. Little did he know that his attempts to cover his tracks, no matter how meticulous, would soon unravel, leading to his eventual downfall. After committing 2 brutal murders, Dr. Buck Ruxton faced the grim reality of his actions. The bodies of his wife, Isabella Kerr, and their maid, Mary Rogerson, lay lifeless in his home, and Ruxton, a man of intelligence and meticulous planning, began crafting a twisted plan to ensure that no one would ever discover the truth. His medical knowledge, honed through years of practice, would now serve a much darker purpose. Ruxton decided that the best way to dispose of the evidence was to make the bodies unrecognizable. To do this, he committed an act so gruesome that it would shock even seasoned investigators. Over the course of several hours, he dismembered both Isabella and Mary's bodies in the upstairs bathroom of his home. Using sharp surgical tools, Ruxton methodically cut apart the remains. His medical training gave him a precise understanding of human anatomy, allowing him to work efficiently. He removed identifying features, such as the faces and fingertips, to make identification impossible. Reports suggest that he even removed tattoos from the skin and extracted teeth from the skulls to further frustrate investigators. The gruesome scene in the bathroom defied comprehension. Despite his attempts to contain the blood, it soaked into the floors and walls, leaving behind traces that would later become crucial evidence. The stark contrast between Ruxton's calm, calculating demeanor and the horrific acts he was performing revealed the depth of his depravity. After the dismemberment, Ruxton wrapped the body parts in newspapers. These newspapers, later discovered at the crime scene, would play a pivotal role in solving the case. Most of them were local editions from Lancaster, a fact that Ruxton, in his haste, overlooked. The decision to use newspapers highlights both his resourcefulness and his recklessness. While he was attempting to organize and conceal the remains, he failed to consider how such a small detail could lead investigators directly back to him. With the remains carefully wrapped, Ruxton now had to decide where to dispose of them. He concluded that distance was key. If the bodies were found far away from Lancaster, authorities might never link them back to him. In the dead of night, Ruxton loaded the packages into his car. He then embarked on a harrowing drive, traveling over 100 miles north into Scotland. His destination was a remote area near the garden home Lynn, a secluded ravine in Dumfriesshire. During the journey, Ruxton must have felt the weight of what he was doing. Driving through the dark, empty roads with the dismembered remains of his wife and maid in the back of his car, he likely experienced a mix of fear, adrenaline, and twisted determination. He was gambling everything on the hope that the bodies would never be found. Upon reaching the ravine, Ruxton stopped and began discarding the remains. He selected the area specifically for its isolation, believing it would be an ideal place to hide his crimes. The garden home Lynn was known for its dense foliage, rocky terrain, and steep drops, making it an unlikely spot for hikers or passers-by to venture into. Ruxton scattered the packages containing body parts across the ravine, carefully trying to conceal them among the rocks and underbrush. He must have believed that his plan was foolproof, that nature itself would help erase any evidence of his horrific deeds. After completing the disposal, he returned to Lancaster, thinking he had successfully covered his tracks. But what Ruxton failed to realize was that his actions, no matter how calculated, had left a trail of clues that would ultimately lead back to him. Back in his Lancaster home, Ruxton turned his attention to cleaning the crime scene. The bathroom where he had carried out the dismemberment was stained with blood, and he worked tirelessly to scrub every surface. Ruxton used bleach, soap, and hot water in an attempt to erase any trace of the crime. He stripped the floors, wiped down walls, and even cleaned under fixtures, leaving nothing to chance. But his meticulous efforts could not completely erase the evidence. Forensic investigators would later discover traces of bloodstains on the staircase, in the bathroom, and around the home. Despite Ruxton's extensive cleaning, these stains, invisible to the naked eye, would prove invaluable during the investigation. What's chilling about Ruxton's behavior in the days following the murders was how calm and composed he appeared. To those who interacted with him, he gave no indication of the horrors he had just committed. He continued seeing patients at his practice, maintaining his reputation as a caring and dedicated doctor. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Ruxton's paranoia grew even stronger, and he became increasingly erratic. He obsessively followed news reports about the discovery of the bodies, hoping to see whether investigators were closing in. His outward calm was a mask, hiding the fear and anxiety that he must have felt as he awaited the inevitable. While Ruxton's actions demonstrated a frightening level of calculation, his plan was far from perfect. On September 29, 1935, 2 weeks after Dr. Buck Ruxton's gruesome crimes, the tranquility of a quiet ravine near the Garden Home Lynn in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, was shattered by a grim discovery. A local woman, out for a stroll with her son near the isolated ravine, stumbled across a package wrapped in newspaper. At first, she assumed it was simply rubbish left behind by a careless traveler, but upon closer inspection, she noticed an unpleasant odor emanating from it. Horrified, she realized the package contained human remains. The police were quickly alerted, and an investigation began. Officers arrived at the scene and found more packages scattered across the rugged terrain of the ravine. Each package, meticulously wrapped in layers of newspaper, contained dismembered body parts. The gruesome nature of the find immediately suggested foul play. The remote location of the Garden Home Lynn made it an ideal spot for Ruxton to dispose of the remains, but it was far from foolproof. The steep ravine, while isolated, was occasionally visited by locals. The dismembered body parts had been dumped in various spots, with some partially hidden under rocks and brush, but others were exposed. The condition of the remains showed clear evidence of deliberate mutilation. Investigators noted that attempts had been made to obliterate the victims' identities. The faces were disfigured, fingertips removed, and teeth extracted. This intentional destruction of identifying features added a macabre layer to the case, as it became clear the killer had gone to great lengths to prevent the bodies from being identified. Initially, the police were faced with a daunting task. 2 bodies had been dismembered into more than 70 pieces, making it difficult to determine the number of victims or their identities. The mutilation, combined with the lack of any immediate clues, left investigators with little to work with. However, a few key observations provided early leads. The newspapers. The remains were wrapped in newspapers, many of which were local editions from Lancaster. One of these papers, the Sunday Graphic, contained a specific edition that was only distributed in Lancaster, immediately narrowing the scope of the investigation. Forensic examination. The state of the bodies suggested they had been killed around 2 weeks before their discovery. The expert precision of the dismemberment led investigators to suspect that the perpetrator might have medical knowledge. The forensic breakthrough. At the time, forensic science was still in its infancy, but the Ruxton case became a landmark in the field. Several cutting-edge techniques were employed that would later revolutionize criminal investigations. Reconstruction of the body's forensic experts, led by renowned pathologist Sir Sidney Smith, painstakingly reconstructed the bodies. By carefully piecing together the dismembered parts, they determined that the remains belonged to 2 adult women. Their work revealed further evidence of the meticulous disfigurement, including the removal of tattoos and any distinguishing scars. Superimposition technique. To confirm the identities of the victims, investigators turned to an innovative forensic technique known as superimposition photography. The skulls of the victims were compared to existing photographs of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. By superimposing the photographs over the reconstructed skulls, experts were able to demonstrate a near-perfect match. This was one of the first instances of this technique being used successfully in a criminal case. Blood evidence in the ravine investigators also found traces of blood and tissue at the disposal site, which further corroborated the evidence of foul play. With the discovery of the local Lancaster newspapers used to wrap the bodies, suspicion began to fall on the area. At the same time, police in Lancaster were already conducting inquiries into the sudden disappearance of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. Neighbors of the Ruxton household reported strange behavior in the days following the women's disappearance. They recalled seeing smoke coming from the chimney for days, as Ruxton burned items he believed could incriminate him, including clothing and personal belongings of the victims. There were also reports of foul odors emanating from the house, which Ruxton dismissed as spoiled meat. The police pieced together a timeline of events based on witness accounts. Isabella Kerr, Ruxton's common-law wife, had been seen alive on the evening of September 14, 1935. She was reportedly returning from a visit to Morecambe, but after that, she vanished without a trace. Mary Rogerson, the family's loyal maid, was last seen the same evening, performing her duties at the Ruxton household. When neither woman returned, concerned friends and neighbors began to suspect something was wrong. Ruxton, however, offered conflicting explanations for their absences. At one point, he claimed that Isabella had left him, taking Mary with her. On another occasion, he stated that Isabella was visiting her family in Scotland. These inconsistencies only raised further suspicion. The combination of forensic evidence, local witness reports, and Ruxton's erratic behavior led police to focus their investigation on him. By early October, authorities had enough circumstantial evidence to arrest him. Under questioning, Ruxton maintained his innocence, insisting that Isabella and Mary had simply left of their own accord. But as investigators continued to uncover more evidence, his story began to unravel. The discovery of the remains and the subsequent investigation marked a turning point in forensic science. The meticulous work of pathologists and investigators, combined with groundbreaking techniques like superimposition photography, ultimately led to Ruxton's conviction. While Ruxton believed he had outsmarted authorities with his careful planning, the discovery at the ravine proved to be the beginning of his undoing. His attempt to erase the identities of his victims failed, and the evidence he left behind, both at the crime scene and in his home, sealed his fate. The Ruxton Murders of 1935 marked one of the earliest and most significant cases where forensic science played a pivotal role in solving a crime. The meticulous work of experts not only identified the victims and linked the murders to Dr. Buck Ruxton, but also set a precedent for the use of scientific methods in criminal investigations. Here's how groundbreaking forensic techniques unraveled the mystery of this heinous crime. Reconstruction of the bodies. The first step in the forensic investigation was the painstaking reconstruction of the dismembered remains found in the Garden Home Lynn Ravine. The bodies had been mutilated beyond recognition, with identifying features such as faces, fingertips, and tattoos removed in an attempt to erase their identities. The forensic challenge. The bodies had been dismembered into more than 70 pieces, making it difficult to determine the number of victims or their identities. Adding to the challenge was the advanced state of decomposition caused by exposure to the elements. Expert assistants Dr. John Glaister, a professor of forensic medicine at the University of Glasgow, and Sir Sidney Smith, a renowned forensic pathologist, led the reconstruction efforts. Using their extensive knowledge of human anatomy, they meticulously pieced the remains together like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. Through this process, they determined that the remains belonged to two women, one older, Isabella Kerr, and one younger, Mary Rogerson. They noted differences in bone structure, size, and muscle mass, which helped distinguish the two victims. Superimposition photography. One of the most innovative techniques employed in the case was superimposition photography, a method that was still in its infancy at the time. This breakthrough played a critical role in confirming the identities of the victims. How it worked: investigators had access to photographs of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson taken before their deaths. Using the reconstructed skulls of the victims, forensic experts superimposed these photographs onto X-ray images of the skulls. The process involved matching specific anatomical features, such as the shape of the jaw, eye sockets, and nasal structure, from the photographs to the physical remains. In both cases, the superimposition revealed a near-perfect match, conclusively identifying the victims as Isabella and Mary. This was one of the first instances of superimposition photography being used successfully in a criminal investigation. It demonstrated the potential of using photographic evidence in combination with physical remains to solve crimes, paving the way for modern forensic imaging techniques. Analysis of the newspapers. Another critical piece of evidence came from the newspapers used to wrap the remains. While Ruxton had attempted to destroy all identifying clues, he overlooked the significance of these seemingly mundane items. Tracing the newspapers. Among the newspapers found at the scene was a local edition of the Sunday Graphic, which had been distributed only in Lancaster. This detail immediately connected the crime to Ruxton's area of residence. Additionally, experts analyzed the ink and print marks on the newspapers to confirm their origin and date of publication. This meticulous work highlighted the role of trace evidence in linking suspects to crimes. Forensic chemistry and blood analysis. Although Ruxton had attempted to clean the crime scene in his home, forensic experts were able to uncover critical evidence through emerging techniques in chemical analysis. Luminol testing. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, investigators discovered bloodstains in the Ruxton household, particularly in the bathroom where the dismemberment had taken place. Even though Ruxton had scrubbed the surfaces extensively, luminol revealed traces of blood invisible to the naked eye. This discovery directly connected the crime to Ruxton's home, disproving his claims that Isabella and Mary had simply left. Microscopic analysis. Samples of hair and tissue were also recovered from the bathroom and drains. Under a microscope, these samples were compared to those of the victims, providing further evidence of their presence in the house at the time of their deaths. Entomology and time of death. Forensic entomology, the study of insects, played a crucial role in determining the time of death. Insect activity on the remains. The bodies had been exposed in the ravine for several days, allowing flies to lay eggs on the remains. Forensic entomologists studied the maggots and larvae found on the bodies, identifying their species and stage of development. By analyzing the life cycles of these insects, experts estimated that the murders had occurred around September 14, 1935, aligning with the last known sightings of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. Fingerprint analysis on the wrappings. Despite Ruxton's efforts to obliterate evidence, investigators were able to lift partial fingerprints from the newspapers and other wrappings used to conceal the remains. Though fingerprint technology was not as advanced as it is today, this discovery added yet another layer of evidence tying Ruxton to the crime. The role of pathology in determining cause of death. The pathologists also conducted detailed examinations of the remains to determine the cause of death. Although the dismemberment made this challenging, certain injuries provided clues. Strangulation. Marks on the neck bones suggested that one or both victims had been strangled. Blunt force trauma. Fractures in the skulls indicated that blunt force injuries may have contributed to the deaths. These findings painted a grim picture of the violence inflicted on the victims and supported the theory that Ruxton had attacked them in a fit of jealous rage. Psychological profile and behavioral analysis. Though not officially part of forensic science at the time, investigators began piecing together a psychological profile of Dr. Ruxton. His obsessive jealousy, paranoia, and controlling behavior were seen as critical motivators for the crime. The lengths to which he went to conceal the murders also revealed his calculated and manipulative nature. Legacy and impact on forensic science. The Ruxton case was a turning point in the history of forensic science. The methods developed and refined during this investigation would become standard practices in criminal investigations worldwide. Superimposition photography. Now a cornerstone of forensic imaging, luminol testing, a routine tool for detecting blood at crime scenes. Entomology, widely used to estimate time of death in outdoor crime scenes. Trace evidence, reinforced the importance of small details, such as newspapers and hair samples, in solving cases. By combining multiple disciplines, investigators built a robust case against Ruxton that ultimately led to his conviction. Dr. Buck Ruxton was formally charged with the murders of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. Prosecutors argued that Ruxton had killed Isabella in a jealous rage, believing she had been unfaithful. When Mary Rogerson inadvertently witnessed the crime, or became suspicious of her employer's actions, she too was murdered to silence her. Ruxton's defense team, led by a prominent barrister, argued that there was no definitive proof tying him to the murders. They attempted to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that the remains could not conclusively be identified as Isabella and Mary. However, the groundbreaking forensic work by Sir Sidney Smith and Dr. John Glaister provided an unshakable foundation for the prosecution. The trial began on March 2, 1936, at the Manchester Assizes, and quickly became one of the most sensational cases of the decade. The public was captivated by the gruesome details of the murders, the scientific breakthroughs that led to Ruxton's capture, and the dramatic courtroom exchanges. Led by Sir Hartley Shawcross, later the lead British prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, the prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence against Ruxton. Key points included: the superimposition technique conclusively identified the remains as Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. Luminol testing revealed traces of blood in Ruxton's bathroom, where the dismemberment had taken place. Newspapers found with the bodies were traced back to Lancaster, linking Ruxton to the disposal site. Neighbors reported hearing arguments between Ruxton and Isabella on the night of her disappearance. Witnesses described seeing unusual activity at the Ruxton household, including smoke from the chimney and foul odors, suggesting Ruxton had been burning evidence. Ruxton's obsessive jealousy and controlling nature were central to the prosecution's argument. He believed Isabella was having an affair, a suspicion that had caused frequent arguments in their marriage. Mary Rogerson's presence in the home on the night of the murder made her a dangerous witness, sealing her fate. Ruxton's defense hinged on creating doubt about the identification of the victims and the timeline of events. They argued the bodies were too mutilated to be conclusively identified as Isabella and Mary. The newspapers found with the remains were widely available and did not definitively link Ruxton to the crime scene. Ruxton's character as a respected doctor and family man made it unlikely he could commit such a horrific act. Despite their efforts, the weight of evidence against Ruxton was overwhelming. The trial was filled with dramatic moments that riveted the public and media alike. Against the advice of his legal team, Ruxton insisted on taking the stand. In an emotional plea, he maintained his innocence and claimed he was being framed. However, under cross-examination, he struggled to explain the forensic evidence and his contradictory statements. Forensic experts described the painstaking work involved in reconstructing the bodies and identifying the victims. Their testimony was both scientific and chilling, painting a vivid picture of Ruxton's attempts to cover up his crimes. The gruesome details of the murders, coupled with Ruxton's cold demeanor, left a lasting impression on the jury. On March 13, 1936, after just over an hour of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. Dr. Buck Ruxton was convicted of the murders of Isabella Kerr and Mary Rogerson. The judge, Mr. Justice Singleton, sentenced Ruxton to death, stating that the crimes were of such a heinous nature that they left no room for leniency. Dr. Buck Ruxton was executed by hanging on May 12, 1936, at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. His execution marked the end of a case that had shocked the nation and captivated the world. The trial of Dr. Buck Ruxton became a landmark case in the history of forensic science and criminal justice. It highlighted the power of emerging forensic techniques and their potential to solve even the most complex cases. Key legacies include forensic innovation, the use of superimposition photography, blood testing, and entomology, set new standards for criminal investigations. Public awareness. The trial brought forensic science into the public eye, showcasing its ability to deliver justice. Legal precedents. The meticulous collection and presentation of forensic evidence served as a model for future cases. The Ruxton case remains a cornerstone of forensic history, remembered not only for its shocking brutality, but also for the groundbreaking work that ensured justice was served. The Ruxton Murders marked a turning point in forensic science. The use of superimposition photography, entomology, and bloodstain analysis set new standards for solving complex cases. It proved that even the most calculated criminals could not escape the reach of science. But this case also serves as a sobering reminder of how jealousy and paranoia can lead to unimaginable acts of violence. Dr. Ruxton's story is one of a man whose inner demons destroyed not only his life, but the lives of those closest to him. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most infamous true crime cases. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.